Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
This week at Safeway, shop the 10 for $10 produce sale. With the 10 for $10 produce sale, get items like large avocados, mangoes, green, red, orange, or yellow bell peppers, cucumbers, large lemons, or 16-ounce bags of Signature Farms baby-peeled carrots for the member price of just $1 each. Plus, select meats like Signature Farms 80% lean ground beef and Signature Select extra meaty pork loin back ribs are buy one, get one free this week. Hurry in before these deals are gone. Visit Safeway.com for more deals.
Well, just like that, season 2021 is over for the West Coast Eagles after their loss to the Brisbane Lions, losing 7 of their last 9 games to finish 9th on the AFL ladder. Though the season doesn't really stop at the nest, and even though I'm in hotel quarantine, I have been trying to work away and provide some content for everyone. So with the season done and dusted, time, I guess, to analyse what has been a really disappointing 2021 for West Coast. It kind of feels like we need a bit of a debrief. So this is a special podcast, a special bonus episode, and I've got a good friend of mine and someone who the Nest family will know really well, Ryan Daniels from Channel 7 News and Channel 7 Footy, to join us, break down the West Coast season, I guess Ryan's origins as a West Coast fan, and talk a little bit about the media industry and what it's like to be a fan of a team while also working and, I guess, reporting on that team regularly, as Ryan does experience living in WA. I hope you enjoy it. I think it sums up the season pretty well, and we throw forward to what may happen during the summer as West Coast look to bounce back in 2022. Well, delighted to have Ryan Daniels on the Nest with us. Ryan, thanks for your time. Appreciate it from hotel quarantine.
Well, we're hotel quarantine buddies, even though we're in different hotels in different states. But I feel your pain. And we're both on what is our last day after 2 long weeks and then previously 3 long weeks in Tokyo. So we can toast to freedom, hopefully.
Yeah, I've organised a banner to run through as I leave the hotel, and so some celebrations, fireworks potentially as well. But no, Tokyo was awesome. This hasn't been a dampener, but it's been a reality check as to the sacrifices required to be an Olympian, I feel.
Oh, 100%. Like it's, we've had the full experience. We've had all the COVID protocols we've had, and even over there, you know, it was probably the same for you. Like it was a really tight system as to what you could do over there. And then here it's been, I mean, everyone's done lockdowns and stuff, but I would hazard to guess that the hotel quarantine is probably the worst of the lockdowns. You really don't get any fresh air, any sun, any freedom at all. But as you said, it was worth it. You'd do it again. And you know what, when we look back in 10, 15, 20 years, this will be part of the experience. And it'll be like this weird event that just got caught at the right time. So it's pretty cool.
So one of the, I guess, good things about hotel quarantine is that I've been just craving the weekends and footy so much because it just gives your day a bit more structure and a bit more oomph. So, I'm sure, and I've been staying up late and watching Premier League and just anything I can get my hands on. But it has allowed us to have a pretty laser-like focus on the last couple of rounds of the season. As a West Coast fan, it really hasn't been all that pleasant, to be honest. So now that the season is wrapped up, and for some reason, there's this weird tinge of optimism that I have after the Brisbane game on Saturday, maybe just because the whole experience was entertaining, and I guess I felt like I was happy for Brisbane, sad for the Dogs, sort of like I got really engaged in the game because West Coast weren't playing that badly, which allowed me to, yell at umpires and sort of get some, I guess, feel like a supporter again, watching the Eagles because they've been so abject and anemic over the second half of the year. So taking all that into account, how have you viewed 2021 for West Coast?
Oh, yeah. Well, it felt like the other day when that siren went. To me, it felt almost like euthanasia. It was like a horrible season for so many different reasons for West Coast. They never quite got going. When they did, they'd always take 3 steps backwards again. And there was always an injury or, a late scratching of crowds at Optus, or it's felt like that for 2 years, really. And this is like, this is not a surprise to me. I tipped them at the start of the year to make finals and to even be sort of a fringe contender. But I think the season as a whole was pretty disappointing. I actually was talking to someone today and I said, you probably put the three teams that have been disappointing based on expectations would be West Coast, St Kilda and Richmond. And I think just about every other team in the comp has either met expectations or beaten them, whether those expectations were like North Melbourne to finish last or whatever. But West Coast are in that group that have really let themselves down. But I think the thing about West Coast is that all of their fans and even people who work at the club as well, the expectation that is set on that club is very, very high. They've spent 6 years contending or 5 years contending. They've been in 2 grand finals. They've made finals every year up until now since 2015, I think. And that's, most clubs would kill for that. There's a lot of clubs that never get close to that. But I think the reason West Coast have been so successful is because their people within and without the club do not accept failure. And this year, one of those rare years where West Coast they failed. I mean, no matter how you look at it, it's a failure. And that's why there's so much noise.
Yeah, if you look at the results over the last 2 years, like, in 10 years' time, if you looked at that team and what they achieved, you'd say that's a massive failure, and it's unbelievable that they weren't able to make more of an impact. But ultimately, games just aren't won on paper, and so the list looks good, but there's so many other circumstances over the last couple of years which have affected West Coast, and basically every single one of those circumstances has been negative. So it's unfortunate, but that's just the way sport goes. So just before we delve a little deeper, Ryan, often we like to get a bit of a gauge on, the origin stories of West Coast people who come on the nest. So what can you tell us about your fan experience and where it all started?
Well, I'll start by saying I think my first memory of football was, I reckon it was 1991. My first game I went to, Peter Sumich kicked 13 goals against Footscray at the Wacker. And I had no interest in footy before that. And being at that game, it really changed my life. If you look where I've ended up in terms of what I do for a living and the obsession I've had ever since, it flicked a switch. I think most people who love footy have had that moment, or a couple of moments like that. Then obviously West Coast were so successful. Have you got someone at the door, mate?
Yeah, I do actually. Just you keep talking. Just give me 1 second. I'm just going to step away.
I'll keep talking. So in those early years, 91 to 4, West Coast are obviously a super successful side. The Dockers didn't exist at that point. There was really only one team in town. I think Drew's probably having a COVID test of some kind or getting his discharge papers of some kind. There was no other team to support. The Waffle was slowly sort of becoming obsolete, or at least lesser. And to me, there was only one club in town. So I became a West Coast supporter. I lived and breathed it. I drove over to the grand final with mates in 05 and 06. In 05, we drove and had to drive back after a loss. 06, they won. I was there. I celebrated. But for me personally, that 06 grand final was probably, I didn't know it at the time, but it was probably the end of my fandom. I just started working, doing some very, very light duties at Channel 7 as a casual. At that point, I still cared very deeply on each win and loss. But over the course of the next probably 10 years, those losses and wins impacted me less and less. And I became more of a fan of the game. I didn't hurt, if West Coast lost a game or if they won a game, I didn't celebrate. It just became, okay, that's the result. Where's the story from that? And it sounds cold, but it's not. I still love football and I still want West Coast to do well. But I equally want Fremantle to do well. I know people hearing that will shudder. But to me, I just want great stories. I want athletes, and these players that, we follow for so long to to have their best lives and their best moments. I love seeing David Mundy win games after the siren. I equally love seeing Nick Nat come back from injury and win probably 2 best and fairests in a row. So that's where I'm at now. I had a moment, I think, when it all hit me in 2015 at the grand final. I was up in the stands and it had been a really busy month for me with work because Fremantle were contending and West Coast were obviously contending. And I had probably about 1% left in the energy tank. In the first quarter, Hawthorn were flying and Cyril Rioli was tearing the Eagles a new one. And part of me was relieved. I remember actually the feeling sitting there going, I'm actually pretty happy about this in some way because I had no energy left in the tank. And that was when I knew, okay, well, I'm different now. I wouldn't call myself an Eagles fan. As I said, I want them to do well. I want WA footy teams to do well. But I like watching the Giants and I like watching Gold Coast's young kids and I like watching great games of footy no matter who's playing in them now. So it's altered me. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It allows me to be unbiased and allows me to sort of track stories and narratives rather than be too clouded. But in saying that, some journos don't go down that path. Some are able to support teams and then also still work professionally. I know you do. I know many others do as well. I'm not saying either way is right or wrong, but for me, this worked best.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because I was going to actually reference the fact that after the 2015 grand final, I did text you, and because we'd had this ongoing debate about whether you actually cared what happened, and I was wondering how you felt having seen the Eagles play pretty badly and deservedly lose that game. And I think your response was, "I felt nothing." But as it turns out, actually you did feel something. You felt relief. So I can absolutely relate to what you're saying. But I guess the difference for someone like me is that I worked 4 paid shifts for Channel 7 in Perth before I moved to Sydney. So I've never covered West Coast at all, really. So I haven't had to put up with the daily grind and the difficulties that come with that. I'm able to have the club at an arm's length and still, I see them 5 times a year when they come to Melbourne and I can enjoy those moments and then just watch them on TV. West Coast for me, it's less of a profession, because I'm covering, I cover West Coast at work sometimes. And yes, if there's an Adam Simpson press conference and I'm free to be able to do it, I will, and I'll back myself to be unbiased and try and give the fans what they want from Simo's presser. But aside from that, that's as far as it goes. I think I've only ever done, apart from Captain's Day, I think I've only ever done 1 or 2 interviews with West Coast players. So it's still all, I guess at arm's length. So that probably helps keep me engaged as a fan a little bit more.
100%. I think if I was a Carlton supporter or a Collingwood supporter, it would be completely different for me. But like you say, if you're in there every day and you're dealing with the politics of both the WA clubs and, the weird media environment in Perth, and it's, there's a lot to cope with in that sense. So it's not like you get angry at them and you don't want to deal with them, but it's just more like there are ups and downs. There are disagreements from time to time. And also, I reckon I probably would have interviewed every player on both lists and some of them 10 times, maybe some of them 50 times. It's like you don't see them the way you used to see them. I will say, though, that 15 grand final and then being in the rooms after and seeing how upset, Natanui was and how, shattered a couple of the other guys were, I felt for them. And then in 18, covering the win, and I was in the rooms when they won, I was really happy for them. And it was a much better experience covering a winning game, obviously, in the rooms. And there were great stories, Sheed's goal and Luke Shuey, who'd been through so much, and he's such a great fella, to see him win and be a Norman Smith medalist. And even guys like Hutchings, who is one of the, the nicest blokes in the AFL, and he was just so overwhelmed. So, it's not like I don't care now. I think it's just it's a different way to support. It's like I just love football now, and I'll watch probably 8 or 9 games a weekend. I watch 9 if I can, and I watch them all evenly. But obviously, for what I do, being in Perth, West Coast and Fremantle are a huge part of my weekly existence and my yearly existence. So yeah, it's just different, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's it's also part of the maturation of being a fan, and I guess because we're involved with footy like almost every day. Like, I work Monday to Friday, and then I watch football for the entire weekend. Like, I don't for 9 months of the year. Like, AFL is just it. So I think we think about the game in just a different way, and that's just the way it is because it's work and I guess our passions sort of overlapping. So it does become a bit consuming, and I guess in some ways it's actually kind of nice to just yell at the TV, and like because most of the time when I'm watching sport, you're not watching it in that way, and yeah. So I mean it's been great to be able to do this podcast with Garby, who I think is the same as me. He's just never had to cover the Eagles properly for work, so we are able to maintain a level of fandom that others aren't.
It's different. It's different over there too, right? Because like you see, obviously Steve-O is a massive Bulldog supporter, and a lot of the guys have pretty clear affiliations. I think Julian de Stoop is Essendon, right? Is that right? Yep. So like, there's a lot of guys who who they support. Whereas, in Perth, I suppose it's like that too. So it's not abnormal. It's as I said, it's not right or wrong. The thing I always laugh about is when people expect them to, like, not have a club that you supported. Well, if you didn't, you're probably not working in football because, as I said with Sumich, you had to spark something. And you had to fall in love with a club or a player or whatever early on to actually be interested enough to pursue a career in football media. So the idea that anyone could be completely unbiased is probably a bit ridiculous and impossible. It's just, I trust 90% of the people to, when they have to, be balanced and just be able to separate the two. And often, in some cases, supporters of clubs can be more critical. Like it's when they're angry and that, if you're an Essendon supporter and you work in the media, you've probably taken a few pot shots at them in the past 20 years because you're frustrated.
Yeah, so, there is actually a fair few Essendon fans who work in the media in Melbourne, so that would have been an interesting time for them because they were basically at Windy Hill or Tullamarine, few 3, 4, 5 times a week for a couple of years. But anyway, we'll get back to some of the fandom stuff a little bit later, just with some quick fires and bits and bobs. But this is supposed to be a bit of a look back at West Coast season. So just thinking about some of the major talking points coming out of the year. I mean, it's worst season, as you said, since 2014 when the Eagles missed the finals, then they go on and make the grand final in 2015. It's the least wins since 2013. And then worst percentage since 2010, which is when they won the Wooden Spoon. That's like the lowest pretty much that West Coast have ever reached in the history. I mean, as far as disappointing season goes, I think when you think about the expectations versus the end result, it's got to be one of the most disappointing in West Coast history. So there's a few things that sort of come out of this. And one of them has been, there's a lot of discussion about Adam Simpson and how this affects his job security. No one's questioning what he's done for the club. And clearly he's a great coach. But where does he sit right now, in your opinion, as far as being secure in his job at West Coast?
I think he's very secure. There was a really stupid rumour that was floating around while we were in Tokyo about Alistair Clarkson potentially coming to West Coast. And the funny thing is now about all these, I call them stupid rumours, most of them are. If someone had told you, I think it was 4 years ago, whatever it was, that Sam Mitchell was going to leave Hawthorn and come and play for West Coast, you would have said, that's ridiculous. That's not going to happen. So nowadays when people mention stupid rumours, and that particular day I had multiple people hit me up and say, hey, Clarkson, West Coast. And I was like, this is just, clearly these things often start in one place and they're usually some kind of forum, Big Footy or something like that. And then they gain steam and suddenly you get everyone texting you. And but most of the time I'll at least make an inquiry with somebody and just say, look, this is probably way off the mark, but any truth to it. And in that case, I just thought, right, I'll just do it just in case, because the Sam Mitchell thing always stands in the back of my head now. But I was told very firmly, Adam Simpson is not just safe, he is very, very safe. He is the man to lead them forward. There's full confidence in him. There's absolutely ridiculous. No one would suggest otherwise that he's going or that Clarkson's coming or any truth to it at all. So I think that West Coast have been over their journey very, very good at not panicking. And some may see that as moving slowly. But if you look back at their track record, it works. They tend not to stay down too long. They tend to, even when they're bad, still be kind of okay. Like, this year they won 10 games. They had some moments where they were okay. It's not like they finished last and won one game. So even when they're bad, they still sort of are bearable in some capacity. So they don't panic. I think Simpson is going to be safe for quite a long time. And it's a challenge for him. He has to do what he did when he got there, which is reshape everything, look at the pieces he has, try to change and tweak that game plan, try to find new roles for old dogs, try to figure out which of these kids is any good, try to figure out if his game plan is now toast, he's got to throw the whole thing in the bin. This is probably an exciting time for Adam Simpson, but in saying that, it's the first real glitch in his run. He's had a pretty charmed run since he's come on as a coach in terms of he's had success. He's probably worked very hard at that, but this is real serious adversity. And I think in some ways he'd be excited by that and ready to prove everybody wrong or right. So I think he's very, very safe. But if they have another 2 years like this, it would be a different question, a different answer probably.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that was sort of the follow-up is, so you think there's another 2 years of sort of leash left for Simo? So some people might say, maybe one more bad season and questions get asked.
Well, it all depends on the mood. Like teams, it's not necessarily about where you finish. It's about what you're seeing. And like you saw that this year when they beat Carlton and all the kids played. And suddenly the vibe was good. It was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, all right, we might not win the flag, but geez, we might have found a couple of kids. And like all that needs to happen next year to change the tone of the people who are frustrated right now with Adam Simpson and West Coast is to find some diamonds in the rough, to play with an attacking mindset, to tweak things. They can't go through another year like they had this year, which was, and last year as well, which was just, kind of everything going wrong. And yeah, there was some built-in excuses with injuries and COVID and all that stuff, but that stuff doesn't fly for 3-4 years. I think Simpson has a very long leash. He's a premiership coach. There aren't many of them getting around. He's had 2 grand finals now as well. There aren't many who can say they've coached 2 grand finals. So I think he's very, very safe. But next year there needs to be some real positivity in their list production, in their game style. And to be honest, in some ways, in the way that he handles himself, because he can get a bit frustrated at times and a bit down with the media. And I think sometimes it's a bit uncalled for. I think he doesn't quite realise sometimes that he's had a pretty good run with the media. We care a lot in WA. There's a lot of focus on the Eagles and the Dockers, but the Eagles in particular. But for the most part, I think he's had a pretty charmed run.
No, I agree with that. I'm fascinated by, as you put, like the excitement around the challenge, because I can equate it to a couple of sort of modern West Coast teams in transition. So when the Eagles finished last in 2010, they'd come off like a wretched few years with injury. Like I think Glass, Kerr and Cox at times all struggled with various ailments and and many other players as well. And because they'd finished low down the ladder a couple of times, they had some high draft picks, but they went from last to fourth into a prelim final. But it's a very rare occurrence to see that in the AFL. I think Brisbane did it from 98 to 99. So John Worsfold was able to cobble together, like say, Nikoski playing forward and kicking 45 goals, little moves like that. Veterans coming back and playing great footy again. And then, get some production out of young players, various different factors. And interestingly, someone said to me the other day that apparently Phil Walsh had his way in terms of the game style, and that was also a factor in West Coast going back up the ladder. That's a conversation for a different day, but they were able to I guess, retool the team on the run and get back to contending quickly. That's one example. And then I think the 2017 West Coast was a sinking ship. And then a couple of veterans go out, the game style gets jigged around a little bit, and you bring in someone like a Liam Ryan and various others, and all of a sudden a flag in 2018. So less of a drastic change from 2017 to 2018, but it shows how quickly things can change if you get it right.
100%. Things can turn really quick. And you're right. I remember when Rioli and Ryan came into that team in 18, and it was like, this is exactly what they've been missing, which was energy, some flare up forward, some forward pressure, guys who can change a game in 10 minutes. And they hadn't had that for so long. And like West Coast right now, it looks good on paper because it is good on paper. They still have a lot of very good players. Now, a lot of those good players are in the last couple of years of their career. There's a long list of guys who won't be playing in 5 years. There's absolutely a certainty of that. But there is a world where if the right things click and they get the right ingredients, then they're back in the finals next year and they're even a top 4 side. And I think premiership contention is a little bit of a stretch, but this is not going to be a complete bottom out. And that's good and bad. I think it's bad in the way that they're going to be too good. The Shueys and the Yos and the McGoverns and the Nananuis, they're not going to allow them to finish bottom 4 and get a really high draft pick and have that great talent coming in the door. But they might at this point also not be great enough to finish top 4 and contend for a flag. So they're in that sort of weird spot. But there is a world where they find their version of Ryan and Rioli, and funnily enough, maybe it is Rioli, or they find their version of, like you said, with when Phil Walsh and Wisher kind of put that team together, and Coxie had a breakout or a revitalisation of his best, and there was all that sort of stuff going on. So it's not impossible. Nothing would surprise me for West Coast next year. If they finished 3rd and were in a prelim, it wouldn't surprise me. If they finished probably 14th, it wouldn't surprise me. If they finish 9th again, it wouldn't surprise me. All bets are off because they're in that weird, awkward spot. But I don't think it's doomsday. And I do laugh, and I'm guessing we'll talk about this soon, about all the possible trade scenarios that are thrown up, because people just need to take a little bit of a breath and realise that that's not really how footy works. It's not fantasy football.
Yeah, and my position on West Coast through the year about talking about revamping the team and revitalising, etc., is that West Coast are pretty committed to this group of players. Like, they're on good money, they're on long contracts, like they've recruited to win a flag. So you can't just all of a sudden completely change, not just one lane. Like, you can't go from lane 1 to lane 8 and become a rebuilding team when you've got all these veterans and legends of the club locked in. So it's fanciful to talk about the idea of throwing everything out and playing the kids and all that sort of stuff, because it's just simply not possible. So there was one bit of play against Brisbane. I reckon it was late in the 3rd quarter, or maybe halfway through the 3rd, where Luke Shuey just decided the game was in a bit of a stalemate. He was like, all right, I'm going to try and make something happen. I think he got a kick off half back, received a handball of whoever he hit at centre half back, and then he ran through the corridor and torped it. And maybe Jack Darling took a mark and kicked a goal or something. And that just got me thinking. I've often thought, could you rehome Shuey elsewhere? Do you think Luke Shuey off half-back is realistic as a bit of a playmaker, and maybe that helps being a little bit easier on the body?
Potentially. If they played it in the right role, whereas he was like a sweeper type, like that sort of quarterback position, the only issue is it can get tough for them defensively. Like later in the career, like is his body going to hold up if he's having to chase around, half forward flankers, or some 21-year-old goal sneak, he gets left one out. So Shuey's strength is, I still think Shuey is, along with Yo, but I think those two are the game breakers that they have. I think they're 1 and 2 in terms of their midfield. So I wouldn't be moving them out just yet. But we've seen it a lot of times in the past. I mean, Peter Matera did it in a great way towards the end of his career. He played off half-back and made an All-Australian team. So it's not impossible. I just think they need to, with a guy like Shuey, you want to get as long as you can out of him while he's still producing at his best. And what we've seen the last 18 months is worrying. So whatever they're doing with him, whether it's role or preparation, they have to do something different. You might remember last year, and I think he had the right intentions. He came back to pre-season early, They had a short break. He came back and turned up with the young guys. He didn't have to do that, but he trained real hard with them, set the example, obviously wanted to be, a great captain. By the time he came back, the soft tissue stuff had flared up. I think he made a mistake there from a physical point of view. He had the right intentions from a leadership point of view, but I think that didn't help him have a great season. He was sort of hamstrung, no pun intended, from the word go. So I think he'll approach that very differently. And I think it's the same for Elliot Yeo. We're going to see a different preseason for him. So I expect those two guys to have pretty good years next year as midfielders.
Yeah, well, he needs to do what MJ did while he was playing baseball and just rock up to Chicago Bulls training and just sit in the stands and just watch. So he's there. The figurehead's there. Everyone can see him, but he doesn't actually test out the hammies too much. So Shuey's a big talking point, I think, for a lot of fans because, he's a Norm Smith medalist and we know that there's been times where he's just put West Coast on his back and he just wins clearances, lays tackles, kicks goals. And we love that about him and we love his story. He's had a tough time early in his career. So hopefully he can get back to being influential on the field, not just off it. So Nick Nat is the other one. So, you said before, a back-to-back John Worsfold medalist. There's nothing more certain that he'll win the best and fairest. He virtually didn't play a bad game all season. And the difference, if you take Nick Nat out of West Coast team this season, they might not have got more than 3 or 4 wins. He's been that good, that influential. He should be All-Australian. I guess that the sadness is that he's probably produced his 2 best and most consistent seasons in years that West Coast have struggled. So the question is, how urgent is it for West Coast to try and make the best of Nick Nat because he is such a prodigious talent, but also such a unique one?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. I don't think it's a surprise that he's been their best player for 2 years. And I think you're right, he should be All-Australian. Brad Shepherd last year was obviously amazing. He's been a bit banged up this year, but he's also been pretty good. Last year, Andrew Gaff was one of their best players. Those guys are the ones that missed out. They're the highest profile guys that missed out on that flag. And the hunger that they have is different to the hunger that the other guys have. I'm not saying the other guys don't care or they're lazy, but it's different. If you've never won, you're going to have more motivation. So I think it drives Nick Nat to get that flag. In fact, I know it does. Now, in terms of maximising him, this is part of the thing. You can't just you hit the nail on the head. Your list is built to contend. Whether it's capable or not, it's built to contend. It's got high profile, highly paid, veteran players, club champions. The list is long of those guys. So you can't just throw it out. And I think that's why the word I had from a couple of weeks ago was, we will go again. They're not throwing this out at all. They think that they can contend next year. Now, whether that's right or not, I don't know. We'll find out. I probably think it's not. But their mentality is, we still have a list that can win a flag. And do you know what? I do think in a normal season, if there's crowds and the travel's normal and the pre-season's the normal length and all of that stuff, they are better placed to do that. But it now comes with about 35 possible what ifs, instead of the really good sides have less of those. You just less concerns and less probabilities and possibilities. It's just, if those 3 or 4 things have to go right. When Richmond were flying, it was right, if Dusty plays every game and they get a full season out of Nankervis and Grimes, then they'll probably be in a prelim. And yes, that's true. West Coast now have a very long list of things that have to go right. But as long as you've got Natanui in that ruck, as long as you've got, Elliot Yeo in that midfield, as long as you've got a forward line that features Kennedy and Darling and Allen and Ryan and Rioli next year, you're going to be competitive. There's no way to be really, really terrible. So why not try to go all in again, if you know what I mean?
So if you think if what you've been hearing is that they're absolutely all in again for a flag next year, then that, and I assume given the lack of communication from the club, is that Shannon Hearn and Josh Kennedy are absolutely going around again.
Yeah, my understanding is it's both of their calls, and that the thing with veterans and those guys who have done everything, and they can be thinking one thing, and then they're like, who knows how they're waking up today is what I'm saying. Like Kennedy and Hearn might just wake up and go, you know what? I can't even contemplate doing another preseason. I'm done. And both of those guys they've won premierships. They're all Australians. Their careers have been magnificent. They'll go down as absolute greats of not just the West Coast Eagles, but the AFL. So they may just wake up and go, oh, no, I can't do it anymore. I'm done. Thanks, guys. So I don't know for certain. If you asked me to bet, I would say both guys will be there next year on another 1-year contract. But in saying that, if Kennedy decides to give it away, I'm not convinced it's the worst thing. He's still their best forward. It's fantastic. He delivers time and time again. But at some point, you've got to turn the car keys over to Oscar Allen and throw him into the fire. And, you know, Jack Darling is still there. And as I said, Ryan's still there. Rioli will be back. It's still a really high-functioning forward line. So I don't think that losing Kennedy or Hearn or both of them is completely detrimental to a title or a premiership contention, as many other people do think that.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Because like we got a little bit of a look at West Coast forward line on the weekend without Kennedy, and you're replacing him with either Jake Waterman or a medium-sized pressure player. So it just changes the complexion of the front of the forward 50 and probably brings it into line with modern footy a little bit more. Like 3 talls is just, you know, it's probably too much. And especially because Oscar Allen's been a bit hurt this season, physically hasn't been able to do everything in terms of laying tackles and being an all-around sort of medium to tall forward. So, yeah, I mean, West Coast are prepared for life without them. Like Witherden's been brought in, and there's plenty like Luke Foley, and there's lots of medium defenders who can step into Hearn's shoes. They're not going to be able to be the on-field coach. And reading Tom Barrass's little tribute before Hearn's 300th game, that gave me a great understanding of that Hearn is more than just a player. Like he understands the West Coast system, and he's an on-field coach for Adam Simpson. So that's hard to replace, but you do have a lot of veterans down back. So it's not going to be completely lost. And again, Josh Kennedy, I mean, he's probably most people's favourite West Coast player from the last decade because everything that he does is for the team. He celebrates other people's goals, usually more than his own. He plays injured. His effort is always there. And, you know, world's nicest bloke. So it's going to be sad to lose him. He's the best forward in West Coast history. But having all these tall forwards isn't necessarily the best thing for West Coast moving forward. So it's an interesting conundrum, isn't it? I think if Kennedy's there next season, you're not going to find any West Coast fans who are complaining. But if he's not there and it normalises the forward line a little bit more, then potentially it could end up being a good thing. So fascinating to see how that plays out. And, you know, to be honest, they're both country guys. Like, you know, they're not fishing for fanfare on the way out. So if they decide tomorrow it's over, it'll be, you know, back to the country or the farm, or most likely, and on with their lives. So pick 10, Ryan's interesting. What do West Coast need most? I mean, it's not often that they go to the draft, and obviously it's not really a very high pick, but it's better than previous seasons. So what should be their first priority?
Well, for starters, that pick ends up probably stretching to maybe pick 12 or maybe even 13.
Yeah.
Because Collingwood's going to bid on Dacos and the Bulldogs are going to bid on Darcy. So it's going to push that pick back, which is sort of, you know, frustrating for their club and for their fans. But I think it's pretty obvious they need high-end midfielders and guys that, you know, and you can tend to get a pretty decent midfielder in that range. Like you're probably not going to get you don't get an absolute A-grade superstar, but you can get like a 200-game midfielder. You can. And look, every now and then you can strike gold and you might get one, but you're probably not getting a Sam Walsh. You're probably not getting a Marcus Bontempelli or, that level, unless you sort of jag one because everyone else, like obviously Patrick Cripps, you know, there's an example of that. A guy that had, you know, a ceiling that only a certain number of clubs saw, and they plucked him. That Fife was the same. But every year the draft gets more and more refined. The guys doing the scouting, the guys doing the recruiting, they miss less and less often. And development at clubs is also much, much better too. So you tend to see now most clubs either get the pick pretty close to right, or, every now and then there's a bit of a shock when, say, Carlton picks Paddy Dow and Lockie O'Brien instead of, Aaron Norton and Andy Brayshaw. Like these things can, or Tim English, or whoever it be, Oscar Allen. So those things can happen still, but it's much rarer. So I would think West Coast would probably be targeting a midfielder. They tend to just target the best player available, West Coast. They typically go with that approach, which has served them pretty well. I think they've got a couple of good young key defenders. I really like Harry Edwards. I think Josh Rotham's going to be a really good player. I think Liam Duggan's going to move into that Hearn role. I think they've got a bit there. They probably need a couple more, but you can find those guys and develop them. I think they just need to focus on getting the best midfielder that they can, one with speed, one with great skill, and just try to develop them as fast as they possibly can. Because to me, I look at their list and I don't see one dynamic, sure thing midfielder under the age of 23. I just don't see one. There's flashes from Luke Edwards. There's the odd, people talk about Zane True, like he could be something. He might have a career, but I can't see him reaching that sort of all-Australian type level of player. So to me, they need to target that position in particular in the next couple of drafts.
So what about, I hear what you're saying with pick 10, and you can get a decent player there. I just had a look through about 4 or 5 of the most recent drafts. It looks to me like pick 7 or 8 is almost the limit as far as getting someone who's can be a jet. And as you say, clubs miss less. Is there a scenario where they trade away a couple of second round picks to try and move up to 6 or 7 and try and just get their teeth stuck into the top end of the draft? Because 10 is good, and maybe they do 50 projections of how the draft might go, and how many times do they end up with that 1 or 2 midfielders that are there who are going to fill that need. So maybe they just need to say, well, if we're going all in again and we've got pick 10 this year, is there a way we can creep up a few spots so we can get this midfielder that we so desperately want, knowing that, if all goes well, we might be back up the ladder next year and not in a position to actually get someone who's going to help us in the future?
Oh, I think they'd have to. I mean, if they're not looking at scenarios like that, then they're not doing their job. So I guarantee they're looking at all of those kinds of scenarios. And if you can somehow get into the top 5 or 6, then, you're going to be much better placed. You've got to look at the teams that are down there and how much talent they need. So you're not going to get Gold Coast's pick. You're not going to get Adelaide's pick. You're not going to get North Melbourne's pick. But GWS, for instance, have pick 2. Do they need more kids? Do they have a bunch still, even after the ones they've all lost? Do they really need another pick to sit there for 3 years and mature, or do they want to trade that for something that's more established, or a future pick down the road? Maybe they might bank that West Coast is going to deteriorate, and they might want to send them that pick for a future pick, and West Coast throws something else in. Who knows? There's all of those scenarios would be on the table. It's kind of like I said about Simpson and the excitement of the challenge. The recruiting guys would be licking their lips because they don't get picks. Well, typically they don't get picks that high. So they've got a chance to get a winner. And if they can move any higher up, then they'd probably jump at it. I wouldn't be surprised. But people have to be realistic about those kids. Whoever they take with that pick, if it is, 10, which turns into 13, they're probably not going to be a world beater for a couple of years. It takes time. The improvement that people will need to be looking for is for guys who are already on the list. I mentioned a couple, but you throw in Bailey Williams, you throw in Cal Jamison, who I've got really high hopes for. Those type of guys are the ones that you'd be hoping to see more of in a year or two. And you hope that they can establish themselves as players. Don't worry about the kid who's getting taken next year, because unless he's a top 3-4 pick, he's probably not going to have an immediate impact.
No, and I think supporters are looking for
hope.
They want hope to go with, hopefully, improvement on field. So if you have, a gem that you can see, 5 or 6 games from, and young players stepping up and being exciting and kicking goals and playing good footy. Like that's one of actually the most rewarding parts of being a fan. Like
100%.
imagine being a Chicago Bulls fan, and I've got MJ on the brain because I've been rewatching The Last Dance. But imagine being a Bulls fan when he just all of a sudden just became a fucking star, like 15 games into his Bulls career, and everyone realized, oh my God, like this guy's a gun. And
I think that was like, I mean, you would remember, and most people listening to this will remember, it was when the one I can remember being like that is Judd.
yeah,
And I remember watching him very early in his career at Subi, and I just turned to my mate Fen, and I was like, "Oh my God! Like this guy isn't just good. He could actually be the best player in the AFL pretty quickly." And weeks later, he was kicking 5 against Brisbane, who were just unbeatable at that point. And by the time he turned 21, he won. He had already racked up a ton of Brownlow votes and was being compared to Lee Matthews. And it was almost immediate. And you're right. That can change clubs. It can change everything about the mentality of a supporter base. It doesn't even matter if you're winning at that point, but if you've got this ticket, this lotto ticket that is, the odds are so high that succeeding, it changes everything. And that you're 100% right. Like it can happen. Now, typically though, that happens with a guy that you take very, very early. And it's less often in footy. It's surprisingly rare that in football someone comes in and you just go, wow, like that guy's an absolute sure thing. Even if you look at guys like Bont, Dangerfield, Fife, Dusty, like you knew they'd be okay when you saw them. You knew they had something, but you had no idea they'd become what they became by the end of their career. But with Judd, it was the opposite. You knew immediately that this guy was going to be an all-time great, and that's super rare.
Yeah, I actually think that Bontempelli stands out more above the rest there. That goal that he kicked, which should have been goal of the year in his first season. Like
that's right. Yeah.
Lewis Taylor won Rising Star that year. Like that is one of the biggest oversights ever. Bont twisting and turning and kicking a left foot goal from like the first row at Marvel Stadium, and Hutto calling it like that's as good as it gets. But
you're probably right. Yeah, Bont out of all those guys I mentioned is probably the one that came on the quickest, I would say.
But then, like I remember, like this. I mean, this has got some relevance to us. Is that at that stage I was coming in and watching those tapes at Channel 7, those under-18s tapes. That was Bont's draft year, and going through all those games. And I remember seeing him projected to go really high, and I was like, like he was playing like centre half back or centre half forward or something for Vic Metro, and I barely sort of even registered him. I remember really liking Christian Salem just randomly. Like he was one that stood out to me watching those tapes. But
I love watching that under-18 stuff. Like you're talking about, I was reporting at 7 on weekends, and you'd come in every weekend and you'd go through, we call it shot listing. You'd watch the under-18s games. You'd write down, okay, Christian Salem, great kick. Marcus Bontempelli, contested mark. And then at some point at the end of the year, when these guys got drafted, or if we did stories on them, we would have all this vision ready to go. So it's like that. Doing that stuff is valuable, and that's what recruiters do. Like they're sitting watching those games, and they're in their minds, they're shot listing each moment, and they're going, right, how did he handle that? How did he deal with that? And when you're doing that in the media, like you did and I did in my time, you find a guy like Salem, and you're like, he's my guy. Like he's my guy. And one of the guys I had was Venables, which was fairly recent, but I remember watching the Vic side and just going, man, this guy is like Shuey. Like he's powerful and he's big for a midfielder, but he's coming out of that pack and he's just bursting away and he's kicking goals. So you don't forget those guys when you see them, and they become your guys. Like Salem's still probably one of your guys, right?
I remember Cam McCarthy kicked a goal after the siren for WA against Vic Country and won a game. And it was like, who is this weird-looking unit with the blonde hair they call Sunshine?
Wispy, and he wispy moustache.
Yeah, and he rocked. I was living in Sydney, and he rocked up at GWS, and I campaigned hard to do a story on him, and they wouldn't let me because they knew. So they knew something that I didn't at that time, obviously, which we subsequently found out later. But so I think there should be some excitement attached to the draft this year. I mean, think the opposite of last year, where like Luke Edwards is probably going to turn out to be a good player, but Eagles didn't even get a pick until into the 50s. So hopefully some hope can be attached to whatever they do. And last time we had a pick around the 10 or 11, or the one time we've turned it into a good player was Dom Sheed. He ends up, winning the club a flag. So you can get someone around that sort of 11, 12 spot who can be influential for your club. So I guess discussing recruiting and drafting and all that sort of stuff, we've got to talk about trades. And I know you referenced it earlier. There's a lot of people, and I've noticed a lot of social media, West Coast, throwing out all the players we need to trade and all these ridiculous scenarios. In your mind, and I think there's a couple of names there, like who is in play to potentially want to be traded, or West Coast decide that it's time to try and cash in?
I don't think any of the big ticket guys. I don't think you're going to see Gaff or Darling or off the top of my head, I don't know, any of those sort of Yo's been mentioned a couple of times. That I doubt almost 100% that will not happen. Those guys are club greats. They're going to finish their careers at West Coast unless they decide not to. I think the one that you could probably look at that is probably likely to move is a Jared Brander. Brander's a frustrating one, I think, because of they don't have a lot of high-ish picks on their list, and he's one of the highest in terms of the younger guys. I think he might have been picked 10 or around that mark. So he has not come on. They've thrown him in a million different roles. He's had moments in preseason games where he's kicked 4.5 and everyone's gotten excited and, training on the wing and he's looking $1 million, and then the next week he disappears. It just hasn't worked for a number of reasons. And the makeup of the Eagles team, because of the way their forward line's so tall, like you touched on before, and because Natanui needs to play with another ruckman because his game time is low, it restricts taller players being in the team. And it became pretty clear early on that Oscar Allen was going to be a better player than Jared Brander. So Brander, his natural position as a kid was a centre-half back or a centre-half forward. Suddenly, that's not in possibility. You can't replace McGovern. You can't replace Darling or Kennedy. Tom Barris has come on $1 million. And Oscar Allen looks like the future captain and a star. So where does Brander fit in? Oh, let's put him on a wing. That doesn't work. Let's put him at half forward. That doesn't work. So it's been frustrating for him, and I think the club as well, but it's circumstantial. So I wouldn't be surprised if he moves. Now, what are you getting for Jared Brander? Not a lot. You might get a third-round pick. You might get an exchange for another player. If I were West Coast, I'm not saying this is what they're doing, so it's just not a breaking news moment, but if I were West Coast, I'd be asking about Quinton Narkle from Geelong and just saying, hey, Brander's got some roots in Geelong. Narkle's obviously a West Australian guy. He's probably frustrated that he's in and out of the team. It wouldn't cost a lot. Maybe he's available. And I like what he would bring to West Coast. I like his age. I like his skill set. So in terms of trades, I can't see West Coast doing a lot. But Brander's probably the obvious one.
What about Jack Petruccelli?
Well, the Eagles gave him a very long contract. I think it's 4 years. You might be able to look it up quickly there. I don't know. I'm pretty sure they gave him a 4-year deal, which surprised me at the time. It's at least 3. It's longer than I thought it should be. I remember that. So they're pretty keen on investing time in Petruccelli, and I think they've had him earmarked for a long time as the Jamie Cripps replacement, as that guy who can run up and down that wing, can have a shot from here on out, from anywhere really. So I think that there's parts of Petruccelli which are hard to find. That pace, that confidence that he has, he's frustrating. Absolutely, I think from a supporter's point of view, there's times where you're like, what are you doing? But he does have some stuff. And I think West Coast are pretty keen on keeping him around, because if you look at the guys in that age profile, they don't have a lot. He's one of them. And he has had some moments which would suggest he can have a career. I have not a heap of confidence in his ability to be a gun sort of top 14, 15 player at West Coast, but I think they see something that maybe we don't.
Yeah, so 2023, he comes out of contract. He signed a 3-year deal last season. So
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I totally understand what they're trying to invest in. Like you know what that St Kilda game in the first 2.5 quarters, he looked like Peter Matera.
Yeah.
Like running up the ground, ball in hands, dictating play, kicking goals. But just Eagles fans, I think, get frustrated because he just goes missing, and it doesn't appear that he's offering that much in terms of pressure. Like there's not a lot of like. I'm sure there's intangibles that he brings, but there's not a lot that you can just see and with your own two eyes at the pub and be like, oh, he's doing that when we don't have the ball. For whatever reason, it's just less visible, whatever he's doing. So,
and he has a lot of those games where you look at the stat sheet in the end and you go, man, Petruccelli had 4 touches. Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
But speed, genuine speed, is really hard to find. Like, and if you look at someone like Nick Hind and you go, well, Nick Hind bounced around. He played VFL for Essendon. And Kilda gave him a crack. Didn't really use him in the right way. And then, you know, eventually Essendon give him an AFL chance. And this year he's the recruit of the year or one of the recruits of the year. Sometimes it's just about finding the right role for a guy. And like Hind, I'm not saying Petruccelli's going to be Hind, but finding pace like Hind has and the ability to break lines and take the game on, there's value in that. It's an AFL skill set. He needs to be a better decision maker and he needs to be better with his execution. But you can hopefully teach some of that, and he's still fast. You know, at the end of the day, he's going to outrun 95% of the blokes out there. So I think that's what they see, and I think that's why they're going to continue to invest in him.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, it looks as though Daniel Rioli is going to be a defender now for Richmond, but he kicked 4 goals in a prelim final, you know, as a forward. He's got 3 premierships as a pressure forward, and all of a sudden probably reborn as a defender for maybe the next few years, and maybe that's how he ends his career. Yeah, and so it's a good point that his skill set is relatively unique. It's not completely unique, but he can be deployed in different roles and bring different things to the game. So I can understand why they're investing. I'm just throwing him out there as someone who, because he has those talents, he has currency, despite the fact that his performances haven't been that great. So it's just if West Coast were ready to cash in, but it doesn't sound like they are.
I don't think guys like Brander, Petruccelli, any of those dudes have any currency at all. I don't think if you went to any club and said, hey, Jack Petruccelli, the best you're hoping for is a 3rd round pick. Like they're not giving up first rounders. They're not giving up second rounders. It's just not happening. So in that sense, you're better off sticking with the player that you've invested 3 years into, countless hours and 40 odd games or whatever he's played at this point. Like at that point, rather than trying to get another Petruccelli that hopefully isn't as erratic in the 3rd round with that pick you get from Gold Coast or whatever, you're actually better off staying with him for another year and just seeing if you can finally figure out what makes him tick and unlock something. Like I brought up Cripps before. You got to remember when Cripps came over from St Kilda, he was, I wouldn't say he was considered a bust, but he was not flying. He was not a fantastic AFL player, which is what he's become. Sometimes it takes a while to unlock these guys. And I reckon if some club was dumb enough to say here's a 2nd round pick for Jack Petruccelli, then I think you'd do that. But I can't see a world in which any club does that. And that's back to the list stuff we talked about earlier with West Coast. You're not moving the guys who have value, and the guys you want to move or could move don't have any value. So it's the same as where they are ladder-wise. That's where their list is, in this weird, awkward spot. If you said to someone over East, hey, Liam Duggan, what are your thoughts? They might go, oh, actually, we kind of like him. Maybe we could work something out. But you don't want to trade a Duggan, and you don't want to trade an Allen. You know, like they're the ones you got to hang on to.
Yeah, I wonder if you could sneak pick 30 for Brander. I think that's probably a good result. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. That'd be a win.
So if you get 30 for Brander, and then if you snuck pick 36 for Petruccelli or something, and you put those two together and you trade up to pick 26, and then you put that with pick 10, and that gets you to pick 6. Like they're the sort of scenarios that I'm thinking about. It's less about what you receive individually, but it's what you're trying to achieve from those picks. So that's the scenario that I'm considering. Yeah. So
yeah, that could work. If you did something like that where it was like a building block sort of situation, and we see that a lot in the draft now because teams with father-sons or academy kids are trying to accumulate certain numbers of points. So often you'll look at a trade on the draft night and you'll go, what? Why would they, like Collingwood last year, why would they do that? Why would they trade pick 2? Well, because they knew they were getting Dacos anyway, so they may as well trade that pick and get something down the track. So teams are often looking to do stuff like that. So, yeah, that's probably an interesting way you might have a future in list management. Because that is an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's just looking at how you can best take advantage of the situation. And I think it sounds as though the AFL are trying to tighten up these rules when it comes to academy picks and next generation academies and all that sort of stuff to make it less advantageous.
Definitely.
But, West Coast and Sydney, I think, have done it twice where they've flicked picks around to try and maximise the result for both teams. So it's fascinating to see how it goes. The left field one for as far as when we talk about Sydney is that Dylan Stephens is apparently going to be available. So he's had 2 years in the system. He was a pick 5. Is someone like a Dylan Stephens who's clearly got potential that hasn't been unlocked, and Sydney have got a logjam of good young midfielders. Like, could you give? I haven't got the machinations down pat in my head.
I'll tell you right now, I would, for Dylan Stephens, he's a South Australian kid, so that you'd have to convince him that WA was the place for him, and you'd have to convince him that you had a best 22 spot for him, because that's been the problem with him in Sydney.
Yep.
For Dylan Stephens, I would quite happily hand over that first round pick. They can't because they've traded too many first round picks in a row. But to me, I see him as an absolute, in terms of young players, as a blue chip. I think, Sydney, once they figure it out how to get him in the side, he won't come out of it and he'll be great. But if he's gettable, which would be hard, as I said, he's not West Australian, he's a South Australian kid. There's some talk that the Crows are into him and Port's into him, of course. Just like us, it works the same way for South Australia. But if he's gettable, you do whatever you can to get him.
Yeah, I wonder what your starting point is with Stephens. Like, I suppose, do you say, just throwing it against the wall here, we'll say pick 10's on the table, but we need your first rounder back. And for Sydney, that's going to be pick 13 or 14 or whatever. And then you have to sweeten it. So you say, we'll give you a second rounder and we'll trade third rounders and, blah, blah, blah. So you affect your overall draft hand, but you're adding what's going to be a third-year midfielder who's got wraps on him. I'm pretty sure he's country South Australia, Ryan, but don't absolutely quote me on it. And I think country kids, it's easier, isn't it? Because they're not actually from Adelaide.
Well, most of the country kids leave home at like 12 to go to boarding school in the city. So they're used to living away from home. It's happened. That's why the Eagles, and this is not an accident, Fremantle and West Coast, I'm not saying they only choose, Vic country or South Australian country kids, but it's a consideration when you look at it and you go, oh, well, like look at Shannon Hearn, for instance, right? Country kid from South Australia, never considered going back. He played 300 games. Mm-hmm. So it does work better because they're used to it. They've already done it. It's not abnormal for them to move away from mum and dad and from, like the confines of their family home. So, yeah, that makes a difference.
And then you've got Shannon Hearn possibly at the club for one more year. I'm sure he would have played footy against Luke Edwards. They probably know each other playing underage footy in South Australia. So there's just a couple of little things there. Our relationship with Sydney is good in terms of doing trades traditionally. That was just one, it just stood out to me. And I was like, Dylan is just exactly what we need. And even better, we're fast forwarding 2 years. Like you talked about not expecting anything from that pick for a couple of years. Well, you bypass the wait. So the challenge is that West Coast have to have a first round pick. So they'd have to move, heaven and earth to try and make it work.
Yeah. But there are ways to do that now. Like as you said, you can get picks back, or you can trade a future pick instead of a current pick. You can do all kinds of different things. My only red flag with Stephens would be why hasn't he been playing? Why have guys like Warner and Errol Goulden and these guys sort of flown past him immediately?
Well, it's all role, right? Like Chad and and Goulden and others have been able to play forward of the ball a bit more effectively. I think they've tried Stevens as half forward and he just hasn't. He's just a pure mid, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You just have to be good at it. So we assume he is. So anyway, I appreciate going through all this. It's been really good, Ryan. Thanks. I've got some quick fire stuff for you just to test your West Coast, where it's a bit of historical stuff. Just quick fire, so you don't have to give us explanations.
It's like a quiz.
It's not a quiz. It's just who do you prefer? Who would you rather?
Okay. Oh, okay. All right.
So
I'm going to say the first thing that comes into my head. Is that the idea, or?
Pretty much. Just make it. You have to make a quick decision. So, 92 flag or 94 flag?
2.
Okay. Purely Peter Matera related?
Peter Matera, first one, changed the landscape of the AFL, and it was a closer game.
Bloody good game. Great game of footy. I think I would know the answer to this, given your stories earlier, but 2018 versus 2006.
Yeah, 06 for sure.
Yeah.
Or very different experience. I actually hold both of them really close to my heart for different reasons. The 18 for work and 06 for personal.
So I watched the 06 grand final with my dad on the couch, eating meat pies and just relaxing. So that was really cool. But then 2018, like being there with mates and stuff, that can't be beaten. Cox or Nat Nui?
Oh, geez, that's tough. I think it's Cox.
Wow. Okay. I mean, the CV for Cox is unbelievable.
He changed the game. They're both really unique players. Cox changed the way we see ruckman, and Natanui's different to any other ruckman that we've ever seen before. I actually think Natanui, by the time he's done, he'll definitely be a top 10 Eagle. I actually think that's not ridiculous to say that, but I think Cox is a top 5.
Yep. Sampi or Ryan?
I think Ryan's there now. I think Sampi on potential could have been anything, but I think Ryan has done enough now to go past him.
Trevor Woodhouse said most talented 17-year-old he's ever seen. Actually,
wow.
Sampi. Glass or Hearn?
Oh, do you just mean from a playing perspective or better career?
I just want who do you want in your team?
I think I want Glass.
Yep. I trust Darren Glass. I think the best way to sum up Darren Glass is that West Coast in that elimination or semi-final against Collingwood took him off for 3 minutes, and Anthony Rocker basically got Collingwood back in the game. Biggest mistake, almost the biggest mistake of John Worsfold's coaching career.
Oh, I think it was. And I think, as you say, the things that Glass wasn't able to do that day because he was on the bench might be some of the greatest achievements of his career because it pointed out just how good he was.
Yeah. Matera or Kemp?
Matera. I love Dean Kemp. He's a great bloke. But Matera, I think, is probably the greatest Eagle.
I think that Peter Matera did things that almost no player has ever been able to do. Like, insane.
Yes. I think in some ways Judd reminded me of Matera from time to time. They're very different players, but when Judd was running and at full pace and he's finishing on the run, that was Matera-like. I think Matera is amazing.
So following on from that, Judd or Cousins?
Ooh. Removing all the off-field stuff, I think Cousins, and funnily enough, if you're just talking from the Eagles' perspective, I think it's Cousins. If you're talking full career, I think it's Judd. And if you're removing all the off-field stuff, I just think Judd's time at West Coast wasn't long enough. Had he stayed his whole career there, he's easily the best player West Coast have ever had. He didn't.
Judd, I'll always look at him just differently for some reason, because most of his career at West Coast, it was always like, when's he going to leave? It's always like, oh, he's coming to the end of his contract. Is he going to sign another 2-year deal? And then obviously we were just amazed by this player that we were seeing. But then, even look at him on the premiership dais, he barely cracks a smile. And then Cuz gets up there and he's swinging the arm and he's celebrating. And yes, there's a lot of baggage that comes with Ben Cousins, but he was everyone who was 8 years old watching West Coast when Ben Cousins was playing, they wanted to be Ben Cousins. Like, he was West Coast through and through.
Ben Cousins, yes, he bled West Coast, whereas Judd he was like a hired hand. He was an unbelievable one.
Yeah.
But you're right. The whole time he was there, you knew he was going to go at some point. It was like, okay, well, we've got this transcendent talent for a few years. Let's make the most of it. And they did. But yeah, you're right. Ben Cousins, and this is the thing about Cousins, and we won't need to go into Cousins, we'll be here for 4 hours, but he was such a West Coast person through and through. And I think that's what, had he played his whole career without all that stuff that went on, then there's no doubt that he's the greatest Eagle. You know, like there's no doubt. You know, he's a Brownlow medalist, a premiership player, and so many All-Australians and BNFs. Like, it's not really even a conversation. Those two guys, completely different approaches and careers.
So always a sadness attached to Cousins, isn't there? Because he really could have done anything with his life that he wanted to, unfortunately.
Yep, 100%.
But, you know, something about watching him just running his literal guts out and then just on the bench, have a chuck, go back out there, go again. And he even, like, we probably don't even talk about it in this way. He sacrificed in 05-06. He played half forward. Like, he was a modern high half forward, almost the hardest position on the ground to play because the ball goes over your head and you have to do so much dead running for the team. And he was an absolute superstar at it. And he didn't bitch and moan about being moved out of the midfield because West Coast had so many good players. So it was obviously a sensational career. We all know that. Djakovic or McGovern?
Oh, these are good questions. It's so mind-blowing. I feel like it's Djakovic, but so close. And I think if McGovern can have another throwback year, like obviously this year wasn't his best, and last year wasn't his best. I feel like if he can have another All-Australian year, I think he goes past Djakovic because Djakovic peaked so early, and then obviously injuries caught up with him, and the last part of his career, it was more about the myth and the legend of Djakovic than actual performance. So I think right now it's pretty close to even. I'd slightly give it to Djakovic, but one more good year from Gov, and he's the guy.
Something about being the only person who could collar Wayne Carey, I think, just puts him in a field of his own in the AFL. Like, It's just this mythical thing of, like, Wayne Carey was the best player of the modern era, but there was just this one bloke who had his measure somehow.
Yeah, it's part of footy folklore, and when you're in that sort of spot, like McGovern doesn't have his Carey. McGovern has his traits, which are like no one reads the play like McGovern, and he also went a long way to changing the way the game was played with the way he read the ball, and now so many defenders do that, and teams have a dedicated McGovern. Every team does, and they try to replicate it. So I actually feel like McGovern has actually edged past him, but it's so close. It's so close.
McGovern's got a couple of West Coast folklore things about, the fact that he was in hospital in the lead up to the 2018 grand final, starting off that play, being brave enough to take the intercept mark, and it was a fucking great mark. Yeah. And I think people like his story. He was kind of like all of us, like probably not working quite hard enough and carrying a few extra kgs, but just a talented player. And the club found a way to get the best out of him. I remember you telling me a story about how you saw him down the shops and he was smashing down a jam donut.
Yeah, that's right. The next day he got sent away from training for being overweight and being slow. And I remember seeing it at the time and going, that's weird. Like, eating a donut in the middle of the pre-season. I thought, you know what, they're running heaps. Maybe, you can eat whatever you want. Turns out, no.
Nope. But and I have retold that story a few times. It's one of my favourites. But, and I think, he's a pretty lovable guy. Even the fact that he kind of always seems like he's injured and then miraculously comes back on the ground. But, he has changed the game in a way. So I think, he'll always be the prototype modern defender. A couple more. Sumich or Josh Kennedy?
Nah, it's Kennedy. idolised Summer when I was a kid. He's my favourite player by a long way. I've got a great photo of myself at the Royal Show in a Chicago Bulls cap, posing. I was probably about maybe 8, maybe 9, with Summer, who's wearing, of course, a tip-top jumper from the ads. He used to do these tip-top ads. And he's wearing one of those jumpers and we're posing. So that's one of my favourite childhood memories. Summer's my guy, but Kennedy's gone past him now. Kennedy's the best forward in West Coast's history by a good margin now, I think.
And then basically it's coach, so Simpson, Woosher or Malthouse.
Nah, it's Malthouse. It's kind of like the way he took. I'm not saying he's Michael Jordan, but the way he talk about Jordan, the way he changed what basketball was. It's not just that he was a great player. He changed the way sponsorship happened. He changed the way the game was played. He changed everything. He made it huge. Malthouse did that for WA footy. He came and he made it. He put that Victorian stamp on it, but from a West Coast perspective, he took talent and turned it into success. And he was tough and he was grizzly. And everybody who worked in that era in the media has fantastic Malthouse stories about this grumpy old Mick and yelling at him and this and that. And all these mind games he used to play with the media and the players and the opposition. There's a bit of, there's nostalgia tied into that. So yeah, I think it's Malthouse. It's not even really a contest.
All right, this one's a bit in-house, but Adrian Barrett or Basil Zemplis?
Oh, they both bring different strengths to the table. I've always said, and I'm not trying to get out of answering it, but when I started at 7, there's another guy there, Chris Young, who no longer works in sport. But I always said I was lucky in WA when I was starting out. I got to work with the best writer in the business, which was Chris Young. I think he's the best sports writer in the country, if not in the best handful. The guy with the best contacts in Perth, because at the time, and even still Barra, he had everybody on speed dial. He could pick up the phone and call anybody in footy and get a story really quickly. And Basil, I think, Basil can talk underwater. Some people criticise him, but the guy he oozes personality when he's presenting and when he's at his best when he's unscripted, where he's hosting things like telethon or awards or whatever he's doing. I think they all brought such great strengths and they're all so different to each other. So I don't know, I can't really choose that, and I consider both of them friends and mentors in their own way. So I'm gonna have to sit on the fence on that one.
I thought for sure you'd go Barra. I just think from the observer being in the office, just like the way that you two interact, I was thinking you'd go Barra for sure.
He's like a surrogate dad, sort of big brother for me. And the people who don't know Barra, he's literally the nicest bloke in the world. He's a big teddy bear. He calls everybody G-Man, as you know, which is short for great man. When I first was going in there doing work experience every weekend, he kept calling me G-Man. And I was like, oh, I've got a nickname already. How good is this? I'm the G-Man, which is short for great man. And then I heard him on the phone calling, I think, 4 people in a row G-Man. And I was like, oh, he just doesn't know my name.
He does like the lean back in the chair. G'day G-Man.
Yeah. Hey, g'day G-Man. And so now everybody, I started it, I think. I call him G-Man. And so now he's the G-Man. So he really is the most gentle, kind soul, and he cares about everybody. And he's just, he's very lovable. So, and Baz is lovable in his own way, but Barra just has this real warmness to him. So, yeah, look, it probably is Barra. I work with Barra a lot closer to nowadays. Basil's off being the mayor and he's busy. And,
I remember, I think through your advice, I probably started to interact with Youngie a bit more. And I don't even know if the average listener, and most of the podcast listeners are in Perth, whether they would remember Chris Young. But I remember how you were saying during that period, it's like, speak to Youngie, like he's going to help you with your development. And he was reading sport, and obviously it must have been on a weekend. And Joe Root made that. He was like 18 and he made that ton against Australia in the Ashes. And his intro to the package was like the best I've ever heard. And it was like, the guy who David Warner punched has given Australia like serious issues on day one, but just knowing the line and like addressing Joe Root as the guy that Warner punched.
Yeah, and he had a great way of words. He'd sit down and he'd write something about, it'd be a grand final or an Ashes test or whatever it be, and you'd sit back and you'd be like, it's almost poetry. It was a real gift. I honestly think he's the best I've seen in terms of being able to put a package together and just not just have sports people, but with the whole newsroom would be just sitting back, sometimes laughing because it was such a funny one-liner, or other times almost crying because he'd hit the emotion right in the right spot too. So, yeah, it was beautiful to watch. He unfortunately doesn't really write sport anymore at all, but my God, learning from Youngie was a massive bonus.
So do you have a favourite West Coast sort of covering moment from your time at Seven? Just we round things out here.
I don't like the negative stuff. I don't think any of us really do. I don't like chasing, when players have had too much to drink or they've done something stupid. I kind of hate those stories. Being in the rooms at 18 and seeing what it meant to them all. And I remember Mark Hutchings, who I don't know Hutchie really, really well, but randomly one night I was at the Dean. Perth people know what the Dean is.
Brilliant.
I don't even know if it's there.
Does not exist anymore.
Right. And West Perth had won the flag, and he was on the Eagles list, but he was still playing for West Perth, I think. I don't know. It was in that weird time when the alignments weren't quite around. Anyway, we ended up both there. We kind of recognised each other. We shared a few drinks, did some shots of tequila. And from then on, every time I'd see him, we'd just have a little sort of oh, hey, mate, how you going? Nothing major, just, a bit of we had a good night. And when they won in 18, I'm standing there, I'm doing all these interviews. Most of it was live. Hutchie's come in and I'm the first person he's seen, and he's just sprinted towards me and given me this massive hug covered in sweat and blood and tears. And he's just like, we did it. And I was like, yeah, cool. I was like, yeah, we did it.
Yeah, well done, mate.
I didn't do anything, but I was like, just that pure joy from a guy who had to work for everything he had. That moment is a pretty cool moment for me. Not because I felt like part of it, just to see this, this bloke who had really had to work so hard to win a flag, and he's a fringe player, and he's just a good fella. So stuff like that is really nice. I think that's, from a West Coast perspective, that's probably one of the ones that stands out.
No, that's absolutely awesome. I mean, that's, I guess, if you had told young Ryan that you were going to be doing that, it's a pretty cool moment. As much as I guess some parts of our job become sort of second nature, and we probably don't really appreciate it for what it is.
100%.
But you'll always have that moment, I guess, being in the
one.
rooms.
The other one quickly was it was a silly one. I did a story. I think we talked about it. I had Nick Nat driving an Uber for two or 3 days, which is ridiculous. The concept is ridiculous. Nick kind of came up with it himself. He's on contract at Seven, just like Nat Fyfe is. And we were trying to figure out ways that we could use him better. And he wanted to do something that Shaquille O'Neal had done. I think he did it with Lyft or whatever in the States. And he basically just sort of been this undercover driver. And obviously people know who Shaquille O'Neal is, so it's hard to do. But Nick wanted to do the same thing. And we legitimately did it. We spent 2 days driving around. He was in the Uber. We were in the car behind. And it was just hilarious. Nick's a great fella, and he was so into it. And we did it for 1 day for 8 hours. And I got to the end of it. I said, how do you feel? Do you feel like we got enough? And he's like, nah, we need to do it at night. So instead of just taking the easy road and saying, yeah, you've got enough, we went back out the next night on a Friday night for 6 hours and got some absolute gold. So that was pretty cool too, to work on that. It was a massive project. It's a silly one. Some people thought it was stupid. In some ways it probably was, but it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
I had a feeling that might get a mention. It was brilliant. And is that the longest ever sports story that's gone to air on Channel 7 News?
I think it was about 8 minutes.
Amazing.
And I had to fight for every minute of that, you can imagine.
Oh, every second.
Typically, even a grand final package is a maximum 4 minutes, maximum. So easily the longest sports package and probably one of the longest packages ever written.
But yeah, I mean, it's Nick Nat though, so you can get away with just about anything in WA. If it's
Correct.
Nick Nat, Sharks,
That's
Nick
it.
Nat, you can get away with anything.
That's it.
Ryan, appreciate your time, mate. Thanks for, I know we've got plenty of time on our hands in hotel quarantine, but good of you to front up and have a yarn with us.
No, it was great, mate. It was fun. A trip down memory lane and some good stuff on the Eagles there. I think my last message would be to Eagles fans, just don't panic. The club won't panic. Give them a chance to figure out exactly where they're at and have some faith, because typically they haven't really let their supporters down too often.
No, I'm with you there. So we'll catch you, and there's a lot of people. Actually, I should give you some kudos. For those who don't know Ryan's story, I'll try and get it right here, but tape library at Channel 7 Perth. I think you studied at Murdoch, and famously did an assignment where you predicted that Chris Judd would go to Carlton, and you did the piece to camera holding a Carlton jersey or something. Yeah, you paid your dues, and I think, did you work in the marketing team or something at Seven as well?
Yeah, I did work experience like you did. I did probably a year's worth of Saturdays and Sundays for free. Worked in the library, which is like where you archive vision on Saturdays. And then I don't want to keep people too much longer, but there was Chris Mainwaring died, obviously really sad circumstances. I think it was 2007. And people might remember they put a charity game on, the main match. They put it on that first year, and it was out of control. I think 10,000 or 15,000 people turned up to Leederville Oval, and they couldn't handle it. There was no food trucks organised. There was no tickets organised. It was madness. So then the next year, the boss of Seven at the time, I'd been doing some work experience, and they knew I liked footy, and they said, hey, we need someone to manage this project. We want to do the Maney match, but we want to do it big. We want to do it at Subi, and we want to have the Eagles playing a team of all-stars. So my task was to basically, okay, here's a bunch of money. Go and get whoever you want to play for this all-star team. So I'm ringing blokes like Tony Modra, Doug Hawkins, and Wayne Carey, and Perry Danaher, and just anybody who I'd ever thought was any good. I just literally, they were like, fly them over, put them in a hotel, and also pick an Eagles team of just former greats, and organise the boots, and organise the Guernseys, and organised, the post-match function. If you name it, I organised it for that game from the ground up, and it was a 3-month project. And from that, one, I built a lot of contacts doing that, and two, at the end of that, the publicist quit, and the boss said, well, you did a great job in the Maney match. Do you want to be the publicist? So I did that for a year, and then I was in sport a year later, and then the rest is kind of history from there. But it was a very weird way to start a career. No,
it's good though. It's your own story. And yeah, obviously I've known you a while, but I think it seems to me like you've moved into the top echelon of sports reporters in Australia, mate. So well done. And I don't reckon there's anywhere else that people go now in terms of wanting accurate reporting on West Coast and Freo, but also most of the stuff to do with the AFL at the moment. So well done. And
thank you. I appreciate that.
And it's been good to have you on the nest, mate. Thanks.
No, pleasure to be here.
This week at Safeway, shop the 10 for $10 produce sale. With the 10 for $10 produce sale, get items like large avocados, mangoes, green, red, orange, or yellow bell peppers, cucumbers, large lemons, or 16-ounce bags of Signature Farms baby-peeled carrots for the member price of just $1 each. Plus, select meats like Signature Farms 80% lean ground beef and Signature Select extra meaty pork loin back ribs are buy one, get one free this week. Hurry in before these deals are gone. Visit Safeway.com for more deals.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.